has worked for, how long have you worked for WDFW?
It'll be 40 years on April.
Wow. 40 years on April 1st. He's been a wildlife area manager.
Yeah, baby.
Now he oversees a wildlife area manager in a region, right? Would that be accurate to say?
Oversee management of all local lands in Oklahoma County.
Okay, oversees management of all WDFW lands in Okanogan County. He's also done a lot of work with prescribed fire. Has a lot of experience with that, and he will share some of that today, as well as general role of fire in Shrub-Steppe. So, here we go for Dale.
Give you a bit of background on myself. I was raised in Ellensburg, Washington, on a dairy and beef farm, and went to WSU and graduated with a degree in wildlife biology. Went on and got a degree in master's degree in environmental science, and started with Department of Fish and Wildlife April 1st, 1976. And I held a job as a temporary job, fish and game tech aide, then went to a permanent, biologist on working on a research project in the Columbia Basin. And I got a permanent job as a wildlife control agent, and that position doesn't exist anymore. It disappeared in 1987, but they have recently recreated it, naming it conflict specialist. So that's kind of getting to be a hint to me that when something disappears and comes back, I've been around long enough. Then after that, I moved to Okanogan, in particular Tonasket, as a wildlife agent, and held that position until 1997, at which time I went to work on managing the Simlahecan Wildlife Area. And while I was at the Simlahecan, how many are familiar with the Simlahecan? I've been there. I know how you feel about the Methow, but the Simlahecan is the best place in the world. It's absolutely beautiful. So that's where I really got into fire and managing fire-dependent wildlife habitat. It was probably 2 or 3 years before I realized what I was managing, fire-dependent wildlife habitat. And it's very difficult to manage fire-dependent wildlife habitat without fire. So through a lot of effort in 2011, we started a prescribed burn program on the Simlahecan. Last year, the prescribed burn team burned 1,100 acres. And the biggest whoopsie in our prescribed burns doesn't look anything like the Carlton complex. So that's the difference between prescribed fire or controlled fire and wildfire. And I'll be talking a little bit about that in the presentation. So I'm going to start off with a short video that the lesson learned here is that we often get too focused on our objective without really being aware of our environment. Hit the go button.
Look at the lights.
Not this year.
So the lesson there is we need to be sure of what we're doing before we get too involved, and that is a lesson for me in quote restoring fire, restoring habitat. So we need to learn as much about what we're doing as possible before we really launch into it. I can figure out how to use the...
Then you have to go onto the actual laptop to advance your
Okay.
arrows there.
So I'm hitting the up key. I hit the...
Yeah, maybe to the right.
There we go. Okay. This is just a little bit of humor here on Ansel Adams. And so the first thing for me, when I began managing the Sinlehegan, and as I progressed, it became really important to me if I'm going to get engaged in restoring the fire-dependent wildlife habitat, that I need to understand what's there, and the abiotic components, the biotic components, and the processes that create and sustain the conditions that exist there that I was in charge of managing. And the one thing I wanted to mention is the silver-bordered fritillary butterfly at the Moxie Bog down by Yakima, east of Yakima. And the silver-bordered fritillary butterfly is generally a more northerly species, so there's relic populations down here in Washington and in the area. So they're a state candidate species. And this population of butterflies were seen in the Moxie Bog, and somebody noted that, contacted the Nature Conservancy. They had a big fundraiser. They got money to purchase this bog, or a big, large portion of it. And the first thing they did was fence it to protect the butterflies. And today there's very few butterflies left because they fenced it. They didn't learn about the processes that were creating and or sustaining the butterfly population. And what it was is disturbance. Cows were feeding on the vegetation that was keeping it short, so the violet that the butterflies needed to lay eggs on and the larvae needed to feed on got sunlight and were able to grow. Once the vegetation, the overstory became thick, the violets died out, or the population reduced, and the butterflies virtually disappeared. So in that idea, looking at the past, what was here previously, and how do we know about the past? What was the historic landscape vegetation was? Fire scars on trees, landscape, scientific studies, sediment cores. You can derive charcoal, pollen, and isotopes from sediment cores that will give you a lot of information. There's sediment cores taken on the Sinlehegan Wildlife Area. I worked with the Central Washington University professor, and she is looking at the charcoal and found that in the Fish Lake area there is a tremendous amount of grass charcoal. They can distinguish between grass and wood charcoal. And for thousands of years there was just a tremendous amount of grass charcoal, indicating that the predominant species in that area was grass. There's a lot of trees in there now. Pollen. They can look at the pollen in the sediment cores and determine what plant communities existed there for the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. Fire history studies, historic stand reconstruction, photos, journals, diaries, reports, books, and oral history.
What's a phytolith?
A phytolith these are silica structures that plants grow, and they're a hard object that does not disintegrate, and they are unique to different plants. The grasses have those. So those have been used to determine where grasses grew that have subsequently been taken over by trees or shrubs. And they've been able to look at the vital lists in the soil and determine that it was a grassland previously. Whoops. Okay, these are fire scars on the on trees, cap faces. I don't know if Paul Hesberg talked about these or okay, these are each one of the get the pointer here. Okay, I don't know if you can see the folds in here or these creases. Each one of those is as the tree experiences a subsequent fire and the fire is hot enough, it kills the cambium. And then the tree will continue to grow and try to heal over those. Each time that the tree gets burned, then it subsequently heals. If a fire is hot enough, it'll kill the tree. And that's where, if you get a lot of duff buildup, needle duff around the base of the tree, that will probably ignite the tree and it will kill the tree. And I believe this particular tree, the pith date was 1560. It experienced 24 fires and none of them in the last 100 years. But with the fuels that have built up around the base of that tree, it would probably kill it. And again, you can see each of the folds right on each tree.
Is each fold a year?
No, there may be 15, 20 years between each of those, or 3 years, 5 years. Yeah, each one is a fire. So you can determine the fire return intervals, and these are basically a record on the landscape of when the fires occurred, or when those trees recorded the fires that did occur. Not all trees record all fires. Okay, fire scars on the landscape. This was a fire that converted this shrub. They say Shrub-Steppe. Well, this is shrub. And it converted the shrub to basically more steppe vegetation. This is mostly bunch grass. And there was a fire in about 1987 that went up here as well. Sediment core, this is, they got 20, I believe it was 27 feet of mud, as they call it, or pores, on this one lake on the Sinlahican. And this is the Mount Mazama tephra. That's the Mount Mazama ash. So that must have been quite an exciting period for anybody that was around here. Old photos tell a story. This is the Methow Wildlife Area. This is Cougar Lake. This was taken in 1943, this air photo. And you can just see the increased densification of the trees and the consequent increase in fuels that are on the ground. I'm certain that Susan must have talked about the fuel load and the connection with the fuel load and the fires, and Paul probably did too.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, old photographs. This is over by the Sinlahican. Frank Matsura took this photo about 1910. And that's the way it looks today.
Hey, wait a sec.
Can we go back? Can we go back? Wow.
It's 100 years.
And again, this is on the Sinlahican. Blue Lake is to the left here. So you can see the change that has taken place on the landscape. There's not a lot of shrubs on the hillsides here. And obviously there's all that riparian vegetation that is filled in. Cottonwoods and the serviceberry and the bitter brush, then bunch grass in here with mullein. This is Blue Lake on the Sinlahican. You might note how open all this is. And when I zoom in on this, I can pick out stands of aspen scattered throughout this forested area. And that's the way it looks today. And Ken, you were asking about phytoliths. This is what the phytoliths are. They're a structure in the plants that persist. This is a fire scar sample. This was taken from a log, I believe, and you can see that this fire has been dated at 1640. So I don't know what the pith date would be. And then 1870 was that fire. 1864. So there were 6 years difference. 1855, so there was 9 years in here. So you can see that the fires were occurring on a regular basis. And this was down in the Sinlahican Valley, is where this sample was taken. Using these fire scar samples, you can plot these fires where they occurred on the landscape. Now, each one of these black triangles is where a fire scar was collected, and it recorded this 1799 fire. This is the entire study area. Okay, these were susceptible samples. In other words, they could have recorded the fire, but it was not detected in those samples. And again, this is 1800 fire, which is a year later. You might note that this area right here, this polygon, is right here. So 1 year later, this burned, and it basically burned around it. So the fuels, there was not enough fuel there to really carry a fire. And then stand reconstruction. This was completed on the Sinlahican Wildlife Area, on Sinlahican Creek, alluvial fan, and Shrub-Steppe Creek alluvial fan. And this is the current stand condition, and that was the condition in 1896. And then additionally, journals, diaries, reports, books. David Thompson was the first European to come through the Columbia River country. He came down to Columbia, past the mouth of the Methow. He stopped and apparently traded a few items with. He wrote in his diary the Methow, and we've changed that to Methow. David Stewart in 1811, along with Alexander Ross, established Fort Okanagan.
Hey, Dale,
Yes.
I was encouraged to tell people there's lots of food left if you want seconds.
Okay.
Or third.
Did you hear that? There's more food. Military expeditions. Lieutenant Henry Pierce. He left Fort Okanagan. Kept the journal as he went down the Columbia River up the west fork of the Sandpoil River to the west fork of the Sandpoil, through the Eneas Valley and down Bonaparte Creek to what is now Tenasket. That is the first place that he noted seeing any sagebrush, was in Tenasket. And then he proceeded down the Okanagan River, and in the area which I think was the Chilliwack, he also noted a lot of sagebrush in that area. Otherwise, it was just grasses. And he continued on across from the Chilliwack, I believe, from the description, he came through Finley Canyon and then came down into where Twisp is now and went up the Twisp River. This was 1883. and proceeded up the Twist River, dropped down at the head of Lake Chelan, and then proceeded out some way up there that was pretty difficult going. And I've learned a lot from these journals and publications and so on. Cattleman Andrew Jackson Spillane wrote a book where he talks about a lot of this early Okanagan country, actually eastern Washington. Ben Snipes, Phelps and Wadley, miners, Guy Waring, homesteaded in the Sinlahegan, and he wrote a book called My Pioneer Past about his homestead in the Sinlahegan. And then he eventually came over to the Methow and established, I think, Winthrop, and he started the duck brand, I understand. So, and then Benedict Gebser, another person who was a miner and a homesteader on the Sinlahegan Wildlife Area, kept a diary. I was able to get a portion of that diary that extended from about 1885 to 1898. There's a couple years missing, and he noted a lot of things that I find very fascinating, describing fires that he was fighting and trying to put out. Anthropologists, Elmer Stewart, Cat Anderson, Robert Boyd, and then oral history and Indian tradition. Now this is something that the Indians had their oral history. We really don't have oral history. We really don't pass on our history to each other, or to our tribe, or to our gatherers, or people we gather and hang out with. We write it down in books, and we put it on the shelf. So we really don't pass anything on to anybody. So if you really want to develop a sense of place, of where you're at, you have to have that desire to start digging into this information and getting an idea of where it is you live, and what's the real world where you live. Okay, I'm going to read from one of those publications. And it was in 1979 that anthropologist Jay Miller, and this is a quote, went into the Methow Valley in north central Washington with a van load of Methow Indian elders, some of whom had not been there for 50 years. When we had gone through about half the valley, a woman started to cry. I thought it was because she was homesick, but after a time she sobbed. When my people lived here, we took good care of all this land. We burned it over every fall to make it like a park. Now it is a jungle. Every Methow I talked to after that confirmed the regular program of burning. Okay, now to the Shrub-Steppe. The Shrub-Steppe is pretty much. Is this working? Pressing the wrong button. The Shrub-Steppe is pretty well defined by the rainfall of 10 to 20 inches. So you can see that this pretty well follows the area that is called Shrub-Steppe. And I wouldn't really say that we're in real Shrub-Steppe, because we do have a lot of places where the ponderosa pine are very close in proximity to the Shrub-Steppe, or what we call Shrub-Steppe. And so it's more in the timber transition and Shrub-Steppe timber transition, dry Shrub-Steppe, dry forest. And again, this is just a clearer view of the Methow, the Okanagan, Columbia River, Brewster, trying to pick out where I believe this would be Twist right here. In fact, it was interesting in reading Lieutenant Pierce's report. He spelled TWISP, T-W-I-S-T-P. Twist. And this is the extent of the Carlton complex in the area that we're talking about in Okanagan County. And the lighter areas were determined to be low severity burned areas. And we're talking about the soil in this case. We're not talking about the impact on the vegetation or the trees. The fact that the trees are basically a lot of fuel, or the shrubs are a lot of fuel, contribute to why this is moderately burned or severely burned. Because you have increased heat residency on those sites, and it cooks the soil when the heat is just sitting there and you've got so much heat being given off. This is a close-up of that fire severity map, and in the Texas Creek area, you can see this is somewhat opaque. You can see the timbered areas in here, and obviously, you know, some of it didn't burn as hot, but others showed up as being severe. This is moderate. But you can see why it's a moderate burn. You've got a lot of shrubs in here that burn hot, and so it cooked the soil a little bit less than severe and a little bit more than low. For about 4% of the non-federal lands in the fire were severely burned. The soils were severely burned, and I'm not going to read the details here about what constitutes severely burned versus moderately burned. About 16% of the lands were moderately, or the soils were moderately burned, and 70% were low severity burns. I didn't say it, but if just follow Ken. You know, if you got a question, just throw your hand up.
So why doesn't it add up to 100?
Because there's some that didn't get burned at all.